The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Dusty Creek, Wyoming territory. It was March 1873, and the town was just beginning to stir from its slumber. Luke Callahan stood outside the general store, his weathered hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. He wasn't much for crowds, but today was different. Today, the eastbound train was bringing something unusual to their small corner of the world. A mail-order bride. Luke had seen plenty in his 32 years. He'd fought in the war between the states, driven cattle across hostile territory, and survived more bar fights than he cared to count. But watching grown men primp and preen like peacocks for a woman they'd never met, that was something else entirely. "You reckon she's pretty?" asked Tom Wheeler, the blacksmith's apprentice, nervously smoothing down his unruly hair. "Don't matter much what she looks like," Luke replied, his gray eyes fixed on the horizon where the train would appear. "She's coming to marry Henry Dawson." The mention of Dawson's name cast a shadow over the small gathering. Henry owned a modest ranch about 3 miles outside town. Nothing special by Wyoming standards, but he had a reputation that made even hardened cowboys step aside when he walked by. Not out of respect, but something closer to the way folks avoided a rattlesnake. You didn't turn your back on it, and you sure didn't provoke it. The train whistle echoed across the plains, and Luke felt an unexplained tightness in his chest. He'd been Dawson's neighbor for 2 years now, close enough to hear things on quiet nights when the wind carried sound across the valley. Close enough to know that any woman stepping off that train to marry Henry Dawson was walking into something she couldn't possibly understand from letters exchanged across 2,000 miles. As the locomotive pulled into the station with a great hiss of steam and grinding of metal, Luke spotted Dawson standing near the platform. The man had cleaned up for the occasion. His usually stubbled face was freshly shaved, and he wore what passed for his Sunday best. But no amount of soap could wash away the hardness in his eyes or the cruel set of his mouth. The crowd pressed forward as passengers began to disembark. Traveling salesmen, a few settlers heading further west, and then Luke's breath caught despite himself. A young woman in a dark blue traveling dress stepped carefully down onto the platform. Abigail Turner was not what anyone expected. She wasn't the mousy, desperate spinster that some had imagined, nor was she the painted city woman that others had feared. She was simply lost. That was the word that came to Luke's mind as he watched her scan the crowd with large brown eyes that seemed to take in too much at once. Her dark hair was pinned up properly beneath a modest hat, and though her dress was well made, it bore the wrinkles and dust of long travel. She clutched a carpetbag in one hand and a worn letter in the other. "Miss Turner," Henry Dawson's voice boomed across the platform as he pushed through the crowd. "I'm Henry Dawson." Luke watched as Abigail's eyes found her intended. He saw the exact moment when her carefully composed expression faltered. Just a flicker, like a candle flame in a sudden draft, before she recovered and attempted a smile. "Mr. Dawson," she said, her voice carrying the refined tones of Boston society. "I'm pleased to finally meet you." Henry grabbed her bag without asking and started walking. "Preacher's waiting at the church. Best get this done quick. I need to get back to the ranch before dark." The crowd murmured its disappointment at being cheated of a longer spectacle, but began following the couple toward the small wooden church at the end of Main Street. Luke found himself walking along, though he couldn't say why. Perhaps it was the way Abigail had to almost run to keep up with Dawson's long strides, or how she kept glancing around as if memorizing escape routes. The ceremony was brief to the point of insult. Reverend Mills, a nervous man who owed Dawson money for a gambling debt everyone pretended not to know about, stumbled through the vows with unseemly haste. When he asked if anyone had cause to object, his eyes darted nervously to Dawson, who stood with his thick hands clasped in front of him like a man waiting for a fight. "Do you, Abigail Turner, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" the Reverend asked. Luke watched her face carefully. There it was again, that flicker of something that might have been doubt, or fear, or simple recognition of a mistake made too late to correct. But what choice did she have? She'd traveled 2,000 miles on the promise of a new life. Her old one, whatever it had been, was gone. "I do," she whispered. "Do you, Henry Dawson, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "Yeah, I do." Henry's response was curt, impatient. "Then, by the power vested in me by the territory of Wyoming, I pronounce you man and wife." Henry's kiss was brief and possessive, more like a brand than a blessing. Abigail's eyes were closed, but Luke noticed how her hands trembled where they rested at her sides. The small crowd offered scattered congratulations as the newlyweds made their way out of the church. Luke hung back, but as they passed, Abigail's eyes met his for just a moment. In that brief connection, he saw something that would haunt him in the days to come, a silent plea that she herself might not even have recognized. Then Dawson's hand was on her elbow, steering her toward his wagon with the same rough efficiency he used to herd cattle. "Come on, woman, daylight's wasting." Luke watched as Dawson helped his new bride into the wagon with perfunctory courtesy. As they rolled away, raising a cloud of dust that hung in the still afternoon air, he noticed Martha Henderson, the banker's wife, shaking her head. "That poor thing," Martha murmured. "She has no idea what she's gotten herself into." "Maybe she does," offered Samuel Cox, who ran the livery stable. "Maybe whatever she left behind was worse." Luke said nothing, but he doubted that. He'd seen the quality of Abigail's dress, heard the education in her voice. Women like that didn't answer advertisements for mail-order brides unless they were running from something or to something. And given what he knew about Henry Dawson, Luke feared she'd just traded one kind of prison for another. As the crowd dispersed, returning to their daily business, Luke mounted his horse and began the ride back to his own ranch. The path would take him past the Dawson place, and already he was dreading it, because now it wouldn't just be Henry living there, mean and solitary as a winter wolf. Now there would be her, Abigail Dawson, with her trembling hands and eyes that asked questions she didn't dare voice. The sun was beginning its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded Luke of fire, or blood. He shook off the morbid thought and spurred his horse into a faster gait. But as he passed the fork in the road that led to Dawson's ranch, he couldn't help but slow down and look. The small house sat squat and unwelcoming against the landscape, its windows dark like dead eyes. No smoke rose from the chimney yet, though the evening was growing cool. As Luke watched, he saw Dawson's wagon pull up to the front door. Henry jumped down and strode toward the house without looking back, leaving Abigail to manage her bag and her skirts as she climbed down from the high seat. She stood for a moment in the dying light, looking at her new home, and even from a distance, Luke could see the slump of her shoulders, the way she seemed to gather herself before following her new husband inside. The door closed behind her with a finality that echoed across the valley. Luke turned his horse toward home, but the image stayed with him, a woman in a blue dress, standing alone in the gathering darkness, about to enter a house that would never be a home. He'd seen plenty of hard things in his life, had done some of them himself, but something about this felt different. Maybe it was the resignation in her posture, or the way she'd looked at him in the church, like a drowning person who just realized that no one on shore could swim. As his ranch came into view, Luke tried to push the thoughts away. It wasn't his business. Henry Dawson was a hard man, maybe even a cruel one, but he was within his rights. The woman had agreed to marry him. She'd said, "I do," in front of God and witnesses. Whatever happened now was between husband and wife, and the law, both written and unwritten, was clear on where a neighbor's concern should end. But as Luke unsaddled his horse and went about his evening chores, he found himself pausing more than once to look across the valley toward the Dawson place. And when full darkness fell and he saw a lamp finally lit in one window, he wondered if Abigail Turner, Abigail Dawson now, was looking out at the same stars he could see, wondering how they could shine so cold and distant when the world below them had suddenly become so small and frightening. That night, Luke lay awake longer than usual, listening to the familiar sounds of the Wyoming night coyotes calling in the distance, the wind sighing through the grass, the creak of his house settling. But beneath it all, he imagined he could hear something else, carried on the wind from across the valley. It might have been nothing. Might have been his imagination running wild, but it sounded like crying. He turned over and pulled his blanket higher, telling himself it was just the wind. After all, what else could he do? A man didn't interfere in another man's marriage. That was the code of the West, as immutable as the mountains themselves. But codes were made by men, and men could be wrong. As sleep finally claimed him, Luke's last thought was of brown eyes that had looked at him with such desperate hope, and the terrible certainty that he would see those eyes again, though in what circumstances, he dared not imagine. 2 weeks had passed since the wedding, and Luke had caught only glimpses of the new missus. Dawson. Once. He'd seen her hanging laundry behind the house, moving slowly as if each gesture cost her effort. Another time, she'd been in the garden, trying to coax life from the hard-packed soil that Henry had neglected for years. But always, she kept her head down, never looking up when Luke rode past on his way to town. The first real sign of trouble came on a Tuesday evening. Luke was mending a section of fence near the property line when he heard it. Henry's voice, loud and slurred with drink, carrying across the valley like thunder. "You call this dinner, I wouldn't feed this slop to my hogs." There was a crash, like pottery breaking, then a softer sound that might have been a cry of pain or surprise. Luke's hand stilled on the fence wire. He told himself it wasn't his business, that married folks had their quarrels. But his father had never raised his voice to his mother like that, never made sounds that suggested violence rather than words. Over the following days, Luke began to notice things. When he happened to see Abigail at the general store, she wore long sleeves despite the warming weather. She moved carefully, as if favoring her left side. When Martha Henderson tried to engage her in friendly conversation, Abigail responded politely but briefly, her eyes constantly darting toward the door as if expecting Henry to appear. "That poor young woman," Martha confided to Luke one afternoon as they both waited for supplies. "She barely speaks above a whisper. And did you see how she flinched when Ben dropped that sack of flour like a scared rabbit?" Luke had seen. He'd also seen the way she'd counted out coins with shaking hands, and how she'd hesitated before purchasing a small sack of sugar, as if even that minor decision might bring consequences. The night it all came to a head was unseasonably warm for early April. Luke had been restless all day, unable to shake a feeling of impending storm despite the clear skies. He'd stayed up late, sitting on his porch and whittling without purpose, when he heard it, a scream that cut through the night like a knife. Without thinking, Luke was on his feet and running. He covered the half-mile between his ranch and Dawson's at a dead sprint, his boots pounding the dusty road. As he got closer, he could hear Henry's voice, ugly with rage and alcohol. "You think you're better than me? You think your fancy Boston manners mean something out here? I'll teach you to look at me that way." Another cry, this one muffled, as if Abigail was trying not to give Henry the satisfaction of her pain. Luke didn't slow down when he reached the porch. He hit the door with his shoulder, and it flew open. Henry had been too drunk or too confident to lock it. The scene inside stopped Luke cold for just a moment. The small kitchen was in chaos, broken dishes, an overturned chair, and in the corner, Abigail cowered with her arms raised to protect her face. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, and even in the lamplight, Luke could see the bruises blooming on her arms. Henry stood over her, his fist raised for another blow. "Get away from her." Luke's voice was low and dangerous, the voice of a man who'd faced down rustlers and claim jumpers and lived to tell about it. Henry wheeled around, swaying slightly. His face was flushed with drink and fury. "Get out of my house. Callahan, this is between me and my wife. Not anymore. Luke positioned himself between Henry and Abigail. You're done here, Dawson. Henry laughed, an ugly sound. You gonna stop me? You think you can come into my home and tell me how to handle my own woman? She's not property, Luke said quietly. And any man who has to use his fists on a woman isn't much of a man at all. That did it. Henry lunged at Luke with a roar, but drink had made him clumsy. Luke sidestepped and landed a solid punch to Henry's jaw that sent the other man sprawling. Henry tried to get up, reaching for the pistol on his hip, but Luke was faster. He kicked the gun away and hauled Henry to his feet by his collar. You touch her again, Luke said, his face inches from Henry's. And I'll kill you. That's not a threat, Dawson. It's a promise. He shoved Henry toward the door. The drunk man stumbled, caught himself on the door frame, and turned back with murder in his eyes. She's my wife, he snarled. The law says... I don't give a damn what the law says. Luke's hand moved to his own pistol, a clear warning. Get out, sober up, and if you're smart, you'll stay away until you can act like a human being instead of a rabid dog. For a moment, it looked like Henry might charge again. Then, perhaps seeing something in Luke's eyes that penetrated even his drunken rage, he spat on the floor and stumbled out into the night. They heard him cursing as he made his way to the barn, presumably to sleep it off. Only then did Luke turn to Abigail. She was still pressed against the wall, trembling like a leaf in a storm. Her face was streaked with tears, and a bruise was already darkening on her cheek. Ma'am, Luke said gently, removing his hat. Can you stand? She nodded, but didn't move. Luke could see the shock in her eyes, the disbelief that someone had actually intervened, moving slowly so as not to frighten her further. He righted the overturned chair. Why don't you sit down? I'll get you some water. You shouldn't have come, she whispered, her voice hoarse. He'll be worse now. He won't do anything, Luke said firmly. Not while I'm here. He found a glass that hadn't been broken and pumped water from the kitchen hand pump. She took it with shaking hands and sipped slowly. Up close, Luke could see other bruises, older ones in various stages of healing. His jaw tightened, but he kept his voice gentle. How long has this been going on? Abigail laughed bitterly, a sound that hurt to hear. Since the wedding night, he said I needed to learn my place, that I had too many heirs for a mail-order bride. She looked up at him then, and the despair in her eyes hit him like a physical blow. I thought I was escaping to something better. My father died, left debts. I had no choice but to marry or become, well, there aren't many respectable options for a woman alone in Boston with no money. This isn't right, Luke said. No matter what brought you here, you don't deserve this. Don't I? Her voice was so quiet he had to strain to hear it. I lied too. In my letters, I made myself sound younger, more biddable. I thought if I could just get here, start fresh. I was so naive. Luke knelt beside her chair, careful not to touch her, knowing how skittish she must be. Listen to me. Whatever lies were told, whatever brought you here, nothing justifies what he's done. Nothing. She started crying then, not the desperate sobs he might have expected, but silent tears that spoke of exhaustion and hopelessness. Luke felt something twist in his chest, a protective rage he hadn't experienced since the war. You can't stay here, he said. Come with me. My ranch isn't much, but it's safe. You can rest, figure out what to do next. I can't. The words came out in a rush. I'm his wife. The law. To hell with the law. The vehemence in his voice surprised them both. Pardon my language, ma'am, but the law that says a man can beat his wife isn't worth the paper it's written on. She looked at him then, really looked at him, as if seeing him for the first time. Why do you care? You don't even know me. Luke was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. My mother used to say that the measure of a man wasn't in how he treated his equals. but how he treated those who couldn't fight back. I've failed that test plenty of times in my life, but not tonight, not with this. From the barn came the sound of Henry's voice, raised in drunken song. Abigail flinched, and that decided it for Luke. "Get what you need," he said, standing. "Just essentials. We're leaving." "But, ma'am, Abigail, please, let me help you." Something in his voice must have reached her. She stood slowly, wincing, and moved toward the bedroom. Luke kept watch at the door, half expecting Henry to return, but the singing continued, growing fainter as the man apparently succumbed to drink and exhaustion. Abigail returned with a small bundle, pitifully small for all her worldly possessions. She'd thrown a shawl over her torn dress and tried to pin up her disheveled hair. Even bruised and frightened, there was a dignity about her that Henry hadn't been able to beat out of her. Not yet. "I don't know why you're doing this," she said softly. "Because it's right," Luke replied simply. "Because someone should have done it sooner." They made their way carefully out of the house and toward Luke's horse, which he'd left ground-tied in his haste. He helped her mount, noting how she bit her lip against the pain of movement, then swung up behind her. She tensed at the necessary closeness, and he tried to hold himself as far back as the saddle would allow. As they rode away, Abigail turned for one last look at the house that had been her prison for 2 weeks. "He'll come for me," she said. "He won't let this stand." "Let him come," Luke said grimly. "I've faced worse than Henry Dawson." But even as he said it, he knew she was right. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Henry Dawson wasn't the type to forgive humiliation, and in the eyes of the law and most of the town, Luke had just stolen another man's wife. As they rode through the darkness toward his ranch, Luke wondered what the morning would bring. Word would spread fast. It always did in a town the size of Dusty Creek. There would be consequences. Judgment. Maybe worse. But then he felt Abigail lean back slightly against him. Exhaustion finally overcoming fear, and he knew he'd make the same choice again. Some things were worth the trouble they brought. Some stands were worth taking, even if you stood alone. The stars wheeled overhead. Silent witnesses to a drama as old as time, a woman in desperate need, a man who couldn't turn away, and the violent anger of another who viewed his wife as property to be broken rather than a person to be cherished. Tomorrow would bring its own problems, but tonight, Abigail Turner Dawson was safe, and for Luke Callahan, that was enough. The news spread through Dusty Creek like wildfire in dry grass. By noon the next day, everyone knew that Luke Callahan had taken Henry Dawson's wife from their home in the dead of night. The story grew with each telling. Some said Luke had beaten Henry senseless. Others claimed there'd been gunplay. But all versions agreed on one point: Abigail Dawson was now residing at the Callahan Ranch. And that was a scandal of the highest order. Luke had expected the talk, but he hadn't anticipated how quickly the town would divide. As he rode in for supplies that afternoon, leaving Abigail in the care of Eleanor Walsh, a widow who lived nearby and one of the few who'd immediately offered help, he could feel the eyes on him from every doorway and window. Luke Callahan. The voice belonged to Reverend Mills, who stepped out of the church as Luke passed. "I need a word with you." Luke reined in his horse but didn't dismount. "Reverend?" "What you've done, taking another man's wife. It's adultery in the eyes of God and man." "I haven't touched her," Luke said evenly. "And I'd think a man of God would be more concerned about a husband beating his wife than about who's giving her shelter from it." The Reverend's face flushed. "The Bible says wives should submit to their husbands. It's not our place to interfere in the sacred bonds of matrimony." "Sacred bonds." Luke's voice turned hard. "You saw her face. Reverend, you think God smiles on a man who puts those kinds of marks on a woman?" "Henry Dawson is a member of this community." "Henry Dawson is a brute who happens to pay your gambling debts," Luke interrupted, causing the Reverend to go pale. "Don't lecture me about God's will when you sold it cheap to the highest bidder." He spurred his horse on, leaving the Reverend sputtering behind him. But that was just the beginning. At the general store, conversations stopped when he entered. Some of the men nodded grudgingly. They might not approve, but they respected Luke's courage. Others turned their backs entirely. "You've got some nerve showing your face here," said Jacob Thornton, a rancher who often did business with Henry. "Man takes another man's wife. In my day, that was grounds for a hanging." "In your day, men didn't beat women half to death," Luke replied, keeping his voice steady. "Times change." "Not that much they don't," Thornton growled. "You mark my words. Callahan, this won't end well." But not everyone was hostile. Martha Henderson approached him near the fabric counter, speaking low. "How is she?" "Scared, hurt, but she'll mend." Martha glanced around, then pressed a small package into his hands. "Arnica salve for the bruises, and tell her—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Tell her she's not alone. Some of us understand." There was a story in Martha's eyes, old pain that suggested she knew more about Abigail's situation than most. Luke nodded his thanks. Sheriff Bill Morrison was waiting by Luke's horse when he came out, his star glinting in the afternoon sun. Morrison was a complicated man, not entirely corrupt, but weak, too fond of the path of least resistance. "Luke," he said, hooking his thumbs in his gun belt, "we got a problem." "Do we?" "Henry Dawson came by my office this morning. Says you broke into his home, assaulted him, and kidnapped his wife." "That's his version," Luke said, loading his supplies into his saddlebags. "The truth's somewhat different." "Maybe so, but the law's the law. A wife belongs with her husband." Luke turned to face the sheriff fully. "Bill, you've got a wife. Pretty little Rose, isn't it? Tell me, if I started beating her, would you say she belonged with me?" Morrison's face darkened. "That's different." "How?" "Because I'd kill any man who touched Rose," the sheriff admitted quietly. "Then you understand why I did what I did?" Morrison sighed, looking older than his 40 years. "Understanding and allowing are two different things. Henry's within his rights to demand her return, and if he does—" "Then you'll have to go through me to get her," Luke said simply. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Maybe if she went back, apologized—" "She's got nothing to apologize for," Luke said sharply. "And she's not going back, not while I'm breathing." The sheriff studied him for a long moment. "You're playing a dangerous game. Luke, Henry's got friends. And the law—" "The law's wrong sometimes," Luke said. "You know it. I know it. And deep down, even Henry knows it. That's why he beats her in private instead of on Main Street." Morrison had no answer to that. He stepped aside, but his parting words followed Luke as he mounted his horse. "This ain't over? Not by a long shot." The ride home was tense, Luke constantly checking over his shoulder, half expecting to see Henry and a posse of sympathizers following. But the road remained empty except for the usual traffic. Back at his ranch, he found Abigail sitting on the porch with Eleanor, learning to mend one of his shirts. The sight of her doing something so ordinary, so domestic, made something twist in his chest. Her face was still bruised, but she'd washed and Eleanor had lent her a clean dress. She looked up as he approached, and he saw fear flash across her features before she recognized him. "Any trouble?" Eleanor asked, her weathered face concerned. "Some talk. Sheriff came by." He looked at Abigail. "Henry's claiming I kidnapped you. Sheriff might come out here, ask if you want to go back." Abigail's hand stilled on the fabric. "What should I say?" "The truth," Luke said. "That you're here of your own free will. That you're afraid for your safety if you return. Will that be enough?" Luke wished he could lie to her, but she deserved honesty. "I don't know, but we'll face whatever comes." Eleanor stood, gathering her things. "I'll spread the word among the decent folks in town. Not everyone sides with Henry Arnaud, dear," she told Abigail. "Some of us remember what it's like to be afraid in our own homes." After Eleanor left, an awkward silence fell. Luke busied himself with the horses while Abigail continued her mending. As the sun began to set, she finally spoke. "I've made things difficult for you." Luke looked up from the saddle he was repairing. "No, Henry made things difficult. You just survived it. People are talking. Your reputation." "My reputation will survive," Luke said firmly. "It's weathered worse than small-town gossip." She set down the mending and really looked at him. "Why are you doing this, really?" Luke was quiet for a moment, considering. "You ever see a horse that's been beaten too much, broken wrong? They get this look in their eyes, not wild anymore, not even afraid, just empty, like they've given up on the world being anything but pain." He met her gaze. "You had that look when you got off the train, and I couldn't stand by and watch it get worse." "I'm not a horse that needs rescuing," she said, but there was no anger in it, just a tired sort of pride. "No," Luke agreed. "You're a woman who deserved better than what you got. That's not rescuing. That's just human decency." She looked away, blinking rapidly. "I don't know how to thank you." "Then don't just heal. Figure out what you want to do next. You're safe here as long as you need to be." That evening, as they ate a simple meal of beans and cornbread, Luke noticed how she jumped at every small sound, the pop of wood in the stove, a coyote calling in the distance. He understood. She was waiting for Henry to come crashing through the door, for this temporary safety to shatter like everything else in her life had. "He won't come tonight," Luke said quietly. "He's too smart to try anything alone, and too proud to admit he needs help right away. We've got time." "Time for what?" "To figure out our next move. Maybe get you somewhere safe. Far from here. San Francisco, maybe, or Denver. Somewhere Henry can't follow." She was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, "I'm tired of running. Came here running from debts and shame in Boston. Now I'd be running from a failed marriage and more shame. When does it end?" "When you decide it does," Luke said. "When you plant your feet and say no more. But that's a choice only you can make, and there's no shame in not being ready for it yet." Later, after he'd settled her in his bedroom, he'd take the barn despite her protests. Luke sat on the porch with his rifle across his knees. The night was clear, stars scattered like spilled salt across the black canvas of sky. Somewhere out there, Henry Dawson was nursing his rage and wounded pride, planning his next move. The town was dividing into camps, and the law was firmly on Henry's side. But inside his small ranch house, Abigail Turner Dawson was safe. She was fed, warm, and for the first night in 2 weeks, she could sleep without fear of being awakened by fists or cruel words. It wasn't much in the grand scheme of things, but it was something, a start. Luke thought about the Reverend's words, about adultery and sin, but he'd seen enough of the world to know that sometimes the greatest sin was in following rules that allowed cruelty to flourish. If God wanted to judge him for protecting a woman from her abuser, then Luke would take that judgment and stand by his choice. A sound from inside made him turn. Through the window, he could see Abigail moving about, probably unable to sleep. She paused by the bookshelf, running her fingers along the spines of the few volumes he owned. Such a simple gesture, but it spoke of a woman trying to understand the man who'd upended his life for her. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The town would take sides, pressure would mount, and Henry would make his move. But tonight, in this small pocket of peace carved out of a harsh world, 2 damaged souls had found a moment of grace. And sometimes, Luke thought as he settled in for his watch, that was enough to build hope on. Sometimes, that was everything. The days that followed took on a strange rhythm. Luke would rise before dawn, check the horizon for trouble, then go about his ranch work while keeping one eye on the road. Abigail moved through his house like a ghost at first, careful not to disturb anything, as if she might be thrown out for making too much noise. But gradually, Signs of life began to appear. Wild flowers in a jar on the table. His shirts mended with tiny, perfect stitches, the smell of baking bread filling the small space. It was the bread that undid him one morning, a week after she'd arrived. Luke came in from feeding the horses to find her pulling a golden loaf from the oven, her face flushed from the heat, a smudge of flour on her cheek. For a moment, she looked not like a frightened woman hiding from her husband, but like someone who belonged there. "I hope you don't mind," she said quickly, mistaking his stillness for disapproval. "Eleanor brought some extra flour, and I thought—" "It smells wonderful," Luke said, finding his voice. "Haven't had fresh bread in can't remember how long." She smiled then, the first real smile he'd seen from her, and it transformed her face. Beneath the fading bruises was a woman who might have been beautiful if life hadn't been so hard on her. They ate the bread warm with butter Eleanor had also provided, and for a few minutes, it felt almost normal, like they were just two people sharing a meal, not a scandal waiting to explode. "You never told me," Abigail said suddenly, "about the war, your time as a soldier." Luke's hand stilled on his coffee cup. "Not much to tell. I fought. I survived. I came home." "Which side?" "Union. Though by the end, it didn't much matter. Dead men look the same in blue or gray." She nodded slowly. "My brother fought too. Confederate. He didn't come home." "I'm sorry." "He was so young, 17 when he enlisted, full of talk about honor and glory." Her voice was distant, lost in memory. His last letter talked about the mud and the cold and how he just wanted to taste Mother's cornbread one more time. They sat in companionable silence after that. Two people who understood that some wounds never fully healed. Luke found himself studying her hands as she cleared the plates. Elegant hands that spoke of a genteel upbringing, now roughened by work and marked with small scars from Henry's temper. "You don't have to do all this," he said. "The cooking, the cleaning. You're not a servant." "I need to be useful," she replied. "If I sit still too long, I think too much. And thinking—" She shrugged, leaving the sentence unfinished. Luke understood. He'd had his own periods after the war when stillness felt like drowning, when only hard work could quiet the voices in his head. That afternoon, while Abigail was hanging laundry, Luke saw riders approaching. His hand went to his rifle, but then he recognized Eleanor Walsh accompanied by two other women, Sarah Patterson, the schoolteacher, and, surprisingly, Judge Morrison's wife, Charlotte. "We've come to call on Mrs. Dawson," Eleanor announced as they dismounted. There was steel in her voice, as if daring Luke to refuse. "I'll see if she's receiving visitors," Luke said, fighting a smile. He found Abigail frozen by the wash line, her face pale. "I can't. What if they're here to convince me to go back? Eleanor Walsh has never convinced anyone to do anything they didn't want to do," Luke assured her. "And she brought reinforcements. I think you might be surprised." The women settled in the small parlor, and Luke made himself scarce. But he could hear their voices through the window as he worked on repairing a bridle. "My dear," Charlotte Morrison was saying, "I've come to apologize for my husband. Bill means well, but he's too concerned with keeping the peace to see when the peace isn't worth keeping. We've brought some things," Sarah added. "Clothes, toiletries. We thought you might need them." "I can't accept charity," Abigail protested. "It's not charity," Eleanor said firmly. "It's women looking after each other, as we've always done when the menfolk fail us." There was more talk, lower now, and Luke moved away to give them privacy. But when the women left an hour later, Abigail's eyes were red from crying. The good kind of tears, he thought. The kind that washed things clean instead of just marking pain. "They're forming a committee," she told him wonderingly, "to help women in difficult situations. Charlotte says her husband might not support it publicly, but he won't oppose it either." Good women, Luke said simply. They want me to speak at their next meeting, to tell my story. She looked frightened and hopeful at the same time. Do you think I should? I think you've been silent long enough, Luke replied. Maybe it's time your voice was heard. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Abigail surprised him again. Tell me about this place, she said. Your ranch. How did you come to be here? Luke leaned back in his chair, considering. Bought it with my mustering out pay and what I'd saved. Always wanted a place of my own. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere the only fights were with stubborn cattle and weather. It's peaceful, she agreed. I can see why you chose it. What about you? What was Boston like? She was quiet so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, crowded. Full of rules about what a lady could and couldn't do. After father died and the debts came due, those rules got even tighter. A woman without money, without family. The options narrow quickly. So you answered an advertisement. It seemed like an adventure, she said with a bitter laugh. A new start in the Wild West. Henry's letters were... He made himself sound kind, steady. He sent a photograph. It must have been years old. Men lie, Luke said. Women, too, Abigail admitted. I told him I was accomplished at all the domestic arts. Truth is, I can barely cook, and my sewing is passable at best. I learned more from Eleanor in one afternoon than I knew my whole life before. Bread was good, Luke offered, making her smile. One success among many failures. They fell into comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge one by one. Luke found himself intensely aware of her presence beside him. The soft sound of her breathing, the way she tucked an escaped strand of hair behind her ear, the subtle scent of lavender from the soap Eleanor had brought. I should go back to the barn, he said finally, standing. No! The word came out sharp, almost desperate, and she looked as surprised as he did. I mean, it's your house, your bed. I'm the interloper here. You're a guest, Luke corrected. And my mother would rise from her grave to box my ears if I let a lady sleep in the barn while I took the bed. We could... That is... She stopped, color rising in her cheeks. The house is small, but there's the parlor. I could make a pallet there, and you could have your room back. Luke understood what she wasn't saying, that the barn was far away, that at night when the fears came creeping back, she felt alone and vulnerable. If that would make you feel safer, he said carefully. I could sleep in the parlor, keep the rifle handy. Relief flooded her face. I know it's foolish. Henry isn't likely to come at night. You said so yourself, but sometimes I wake up thinking I hear... She broke off, embarrassed. It's not foolish, Luke said firmly. Fear doesn't follow logic. After the war, I spent 6 months jumping at every loud noise, reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. Healing takes time. That night, Luke made his bed on the floor of the parlor, his rifle within easy reach. Through the thin walls, he could hear Abigail moving about in his room, settling in for sleep. It felt strange and intimate, being so close yet separated. He'd lived alone for so long, he'd forgotten what it was like to be aware of another person's presence, to breathe the same air, to share the same space. Luke, her voice came soft through the darkness. Yes, thank you for everything, but especially for not making me feel ashamed. He stared up at the ceiling, searching for the right words. Nothing that was done to you is your shame to carry. Remember that. I'm trying, she whispered. Good night. Good night, Abigail. As sleep finally took him, Luke thought about how his name sounded in her voice, soft and trusting, like a gift he hadn't known he wanted. Outside, a coyote called to its pack, and the wind rattled the windows. But inside the small ranch house, 2 wounded souls found a measure of peace in each other's company. The storm was coming. Henry wouldn't stay away forever, and the town's judgment would grow harsher. But for now, In this quiet moment suspended between what was and what might be, they had built something fragile and precious. A friendship, perhaps. A foundation for something more, if they dared to dream it. Luke's last conscious thought was of bread rising in the warmth of the stove, of flour on a woman's cheek, of a smile that transformed sorrow into something approaching hope. Such small things, really, but in a life carved from loneliness and duty, sometimes the small things were everything. In his room, Abigail lay awake a while longer, listening to the sound of Luke's breathing evening out into sleep. For the first time since stepping off the train in Dusty Creek, she didn't feel like a woman running from one disaster to another. She felt like someone who might, just might, be running towards something instead. The peace couldn't last. 3 weeks after Abigail had taken shelter at Luke's ranch, Henry Dawson made his move. It started with small harassments. Luke's cattle began turning up on Dawson land. Despite secure fencing, dead animals appeared at his property line, coyotes, Henry claimed, though the wounds looked suspiciously like knife work. Then came the night riders, circling the ranch at odd hours, whooping and firing shots into the air before disappearing into the darkness. "He's trying to wear us down," Luke said one morning, examining fresh horse tracks near the well. "Make us jumpy, scared. It's working on the livestock. Lost 2 calves this week to spooked stampedes." Abigail stood beside him, wrapped in a shawl against the morning chill. The past weeks had brought color back to her cheeks and strength to her bearing, but now worry creased her brow again. "This is my fault," she said quietly. "Your ranch is suffering because of me." "My ranch is suffering because Henry Dawson is a vindictive coward," Luke corrected firmly. "Don't take on responsibility for his choices." But the pressure wasn't just coming from Henry. That afternoon, Sheriff Morrison arrived with 2 deputies and a document that made Luke's blood run cold. "It's a writ of restitution," the sheriff explained, though he wouldn't meet Luke's eyes. "Signed by Judge Palmer over in Cheyenne, says Mrs. Dawson must be returned to her lawful husband, or you'll be charged with alienation of affection and criminal interference with a marriage." Luke scanned the document, his jaw tightening. "Palmer's Henry's cousin. This isn't worth the paper it's written on." "Maybe not morally," Morrison admitted. "But legally, it's binding. You've got 3 days to comply, or I'll have to arrest you." "Then arrest me," Luke said flatly. "Luke, no!" Abigail had been listening from the doorway. She stepped forward now, pale but determined. "I won't have you imprisoned because of me. I'll go back." "Like hell you will," Luke growled. Morrison shifted uncomfortably. There might be another way. If Mrs. Dawson were to file for divorce on grounds of cruelty. "In this territory," Luke laughed bitterly. "With what proof her word against his, you know how that would go. Bill!" "I'm trying to help," the sheriff said defensively. "Then stop hiding behind papers and actually do something." Luke shot back. "You know what he is. Half the town knows, but it's easier to look away, isn't it?" Morrison's face flushed. "I enforce the law. Callahan, I don't make it." "Then maybe it's time someone reminded you that there's a higher law than what's written in books." After the sheriff left, Luke found Abigail in the kitchen, standing at the stove but not really seeing it. Her hands were shaking. "I meant what I said," she whispered. "I'll go back before I see you arrested." Luke crossed to her in 2 strides, gently turning her to face him. It was the first time he'd touched her intentionally since that night he'd carried her from Henry's house, and he felt her tense, then slowly relax. "Look at me," he said softly. When she raised her eyes to his, he continued. "I've been arrested before, spent time in military stockades, frontier jails. Stonewalls don't scare me. But sending you back to him, that would break something in me that wouldn't heal." "Why?" The word was barely a whisper. "Why do you care so much?" Luke was quiet for a long moment, his hands still gentle on her shoulders. Because somewhere between that first morning you made bread and last night when you laughed at my terrible joke about the rooster, you became important. Because seeing you find your strength again has been like watching the sun rise after a long night. Because he stopped, aware he was saying too much, crossing lines that perhaps shouldn't be crossed. But Abigail reached up, her fingers barely brushing his hand where it rested on her shoulder. Because, she prompted, her voice trembling. Because I've fallen in love with you. Luke said simply, God help me, I have, and I know I have no right. Know you're still married. Know 100 reasons why I should keep my mouth shut. But if I'm going to jail in 3 days, I want you to know the truth. You're not just some woman I'm protecting out of duty. You're everything I didn't know I was looking for. Tears welled in her eyes, and for a terrible moment, Luke thought he'd ruined everything. Then she laughed, a broken, beautiful sound. You foolish, wonderful man, she said. Don't you know I've been falling in love with you since the day you told me I could sleep safely? Since you gave me your bed and asked nothing in return? Since you looked at me and saw a person, not property? The space between them collapsed. Luke pulled her against him, and she came willingly, burying her face against his chest. He could feel her tears soaking through his shirt, feel her body shaking with the force of emotions too long contained. This is impossible, she whispered against him. I'm married. The law. Damn the law, Luke said fiercely. We'll figure something out. I won't let him have you back. Not now. Not ever. They stood that way for a long time, holding each other in the kitchen while afternoon light slanted through the windows. It was the first real peace either had felt in days, maybe weeks, but it couldn't last. That night, the harassment escalated. Luke woke to the smell of smoke and the orange glow of fire. The hay barn was ablaze, flames licking hungrily at the dry timber. He rushed out, Abigail close behind, and together they fought the fire with buckets of water from the well. By the time they got it under control, half the structure was gone, along with most of his winter feed. This has to stop, Abigail said as they stood watching the smoldering ruins. Her face was smudged with soot, her hair wild from the night wind. He won't quit until someone's dead. Luke knew she was right. Henry had moved beyond legal maneuvering into outright violence. Next time it might be the house, with them inside it. Pack what you need, he said suddenly. We're leaving. What, Luke? This is your home. It's just land and buildings. You're what matters. He turned to her, decision crystallizing. We'll go to California, or Oregon, somewhere far enough that Henry won't follow. Start fresh where nobody knows us. Running away, she shook her head. That's not you. You're the man who stands and fights. I'm the man who loves you, Luke corrected. And sometimes the smartest fight is the one you don't have. But even as he said it, he knew she was right. Running went against everything he was, everything he believed. And there was no guarantee Henry wouldn't follow, wouldn't hire men to track them down. You couldn't build a life on a foundation of fear. There's another way, Abigail said slowly. But you won't like it. Tell me. She took a deep breath. I go back to him, publicly, make a show of submission. And then, her eyes hardened, then I wait for him to make a mistake. He drinks. When he's deep in his cups, accidents happen. A man could fall downstairs, or off a horse, or... No, Luke's voice was sharp. I won't have you become a killer. Not for me, not for anyone. Then what? She spread her hands helplessly. We can't run, we can't fight the law, and I won't see you imprisoned. What's left? Luke stared at the dying embers of his barn, thinking hard. There had to be a way. In war, when frontal assault failed, you found the enemy's weak point. Henry's weak point was his pride, his need to be seen as powerful. If that could be turned against him. I have an idea, he said slowly. But it's risky, and it'll require help from people who might not want to give it. Tell me, Henry's built his power on fear and intimidation. But what if the town stopped being afraid? What if enough people stood up at once, said, "Enough is enough"? Even Sheriff Morrison couldn't arrest everyone. Abigail considered this. The Women's Committee. Charlotte Morrison said they had more support than they'd expected, and some of the ranchers are tired of Henry's bullying over water rights and grazing land. It would have to be public, Luke said, the plan taking shape. Very public. Force Henry to show his true colors where everyone can see, where even the law would have to take notice. The church social, Abigail said suddenly. It's in 2 days. Everyone will be there. Luke nodded slowly. If Henry knew you'd be there, he'd come. And if he lost control in front of the whole town. It's dangerous, Abigail said. He probably will. Try to hurt you, Luke finished, which is why you won't be alone. Not for a second. She looked up at him, fear and hope warring in her eyes. Do you really think it could work? I think it's better than running or hiding or letting them put me in jail. Luke said, I think it's time for Dusty Creek to decide what kind of town it wants to be. They spent the rest of the night planning, and as dawn broke over the damaged ranch, Luke felt something he hadn't experienced since the war, the calm that came before battle, when all the choices were made and only the execution remained. Henry Dawson thought he'd won, thought he had them cornered, but cornered animals were the most dangerous. And Henry had forgotten one crucial thing. Luke Callahan had survived 4 years of war by never fighting the battle his enemy expected. In 2 days, everything would come to a head. Win or lose, the waiting would be over, and one way or another, Abigail would be free, or they'd both pay the price for challenging the way things had always been. The morning of the church social dawned clear and bright, a perfect spring day that seemed to mock the tension thrumming through Luke's body. He'd spent the previous day riding to neighboring ranches, talking to men he'd known for years, calling in old debts and favors. Some had turned him away, but more had listened, nodding slowly as he laid out his plan. It's time, he'd told each of them. Time to stop letting one man hold this town hostage to his temper. Now, as he helped Abigail into Eleanor's borrowed buggy, he could see the fear she was trying to hide. She wore a simple green dress that Eleanor had altered to fit, her hair pinned up properly, looking every inch the respectable woman she'd always been. You don't have to do this, he said one last time. Yes, I do. Her chin lifted with that stubbornness he'd come to love. I've spent my whole life letting others make my choices. Not today. The church grounds were already crowded when they arrived. Tables groaned under the weight of pies and cakes. Children ran between the adults' legs, and the sound of fiddle music drifted on the air. It would have been a perfect picture of frontier community, if not for the way conversation stopped as Luke and Abigail passed, the way eyes followed their movement. Eleanor met them near the church steps, Martha Henderson at her side. He's here, Eleanor said quietly. Been drinking already, by the look of him. Sheriff Morrison's keeping an eye on things, but he won't act unless forced to. Luke finished. I know. Are the others ready? Martha nodded. Charlotte Morrison has 24 women prepared to stand with Abigail if needed, and Tom Wheeler says at least 10 of the younger men are tired of Henry's bullying. It might not be enough, Eleanor warned. It'll have to be, Luke said. They moved into the crowd, Abigail on Luke's arm, projecting a calm neither felt. Luke could see Henry near the beer barrels, surrounded by his usual cronies, Jacob Thornton, Pete Garrett, a few others who profited from Henry's protection. Henry's face was already flushed, his voice too loud as he told some story that had his companions laughing nervously. There's my wayward wife. Henry's voice cut across the gathering as he spotted them. The fiddle music faltered, then stopped entirely. Come to your senses, finally. Have you... Luke felt Abigail's hand tighten on his arm, but her voice was steady when she spoke. I've come to enjoy the social. Henry, same as everyone else. Enjoy. Henry pushed through the crowd toward them, his movements just unsteady enough to confirm Eleanor's assessment. You don't get to enjoy anything, woman. You get to come home where you belong. I belong where I choose to be, Abigail said clearly, her voice carrying across the now silent gathering. Henry's face darkened. You belong to me. Says so right in the marriage papers. Isn't that right? Sheriff Morrison, standing near the punch table, looked deeply uncomfortable. Now, Henry, this isn't the place. Answer the question, Henry snarled. Doesn't a wife belong with her husband? The law says, Morrison began, but Charlotte stepped forward, cutting him off. The law says a lot of things, she said coolly, including that assault is a crime, even when committed by a husband against his wife. You keep your mouth shut, woman, Henry spat. This is between me and what's mine. She's not property, Luke said, stepping slightly in front of Abigail. And you do well to remember that. Henry laughed, an ugly sound. The great Luke Callahan. Think you're some kind of hero? You're nothing but a thief who took another man's wife. I took in a woman who was being beaten, Luke corrected. Any decent man would have done the same. Decent, Henry's voice rose. You want to talk about decent? She's my wife. I paid for her passage, put a roof over her head, and she repays me by spreading lies and running off with the first man to sweet-talk her. What lies? Abigail stepped around Luke, her fear transforming into anger. That you hit me, that you treated me worse than you treat your horses. Everyone here can see the truth. Henry, some of these bruises still haven't faded completely. A murmur ran through the crowd. Some of the women moved closer, forming a protective semicircle behind Abigail. You provoked me, Henry said. But for the first time, there was uncertainty in his voice. He hadn't expected public defiance. A man's got a right to discipline his wife. Discipline. Sarah Patterson, the schoolteacher, spoke up. Is that what you call leaving bruises on her arms blackening her eye? She's lying, Henry insisted, but his support was wavering. Even some of his cronies were stepping back, not wanting to be associated with what was unfolding. I saw the bruises myself, Eleanor said firmly. The night Luke brought her to safety. As did I, Martha added. And I, Charlotte Morrison said, looking pointedly at her husband. Perhaps it's time we stopped pretending we don't know what kind of man Henry Dawson really is. Henry's face had gone from red to purple. You women don't know your place, Sheriff. I demand you arrest Callahan right now for theft and interference. Morrison hesitated, looking around at the crowd. More men had joined the women now, ranchers and townsmen who'd had their own run-ins with Henry's temper and greed. Seems to me, said George Sullivan, who owned the spread north of town, that a man who can't control himself shouldn't be talking about controlling others. You threatening me? Sullivan. Henry's hand moved toward his gun. I'd think real careful about that next move, Luke said quietly. His own hand hadn't moved, but there was something in his stance that made Henry freeze. You pull that gun in front of all these people, including women and children, and even your cousin, the judge, won't be able to protect you. This isn't over, Henry snarled. You think you've won something here? I'll see you in jail. Callahan. And as for you, he turned his rage on Abigail. You'll learn what happens to wives who forget their... He never finished the sentence. His movement toward Abigail was quick, his hand raised, and in that moment his true nature was revealed for all to see. But Luke was quicker. He stepped between them, catching Henry's wrist in an iron grip. Touch her again, Luke said, his voice deadly quiet. And it'll be the last thing you ever do. Henry yanked free, stumbling backward. He looked around wildly, seeing the condemnation in the faces surrounding him. Even his usual allies had stepped away, not willing to support a man who would strike a woman in public, in front of children and churchgoers. This whole town's gone soft, he spat. But I know my rights. She's my wife. And the law. The law protects all citizens. A new voice interrupted. Judge William Hartford, the circuit judge who happened to be attending the social, stepped forward. Unlike Henry's cousin in Cheyenne, Hartford had a reputation for fairness, including wives who are being abused by their husbands. Mrs. Dawson, if you wish to file for divorce on grounds of cruelty and violence, I'll hear your petition personally. The crowd held its breath. Divorce was scandal enough, but a public declaration. Abigail lifted her chin, meeting the judge's eyes squarely. I do wish it. Your Honor, I have witnesses to testify to the abuse I suffered. I'll testify, Eleanor said immediately. As will I, Martha added. And I, Charlotte Morrison said, causing her husband to wince. One by one, voices rose from the crowd. Women and men who'd seen the bruises, heard the screams, watched Henry's rage poison their town for too long. Henry stood isolated in the center of it all, his face cycling through rage, disbelief, and something that might have been fear. You can't do this, she's mine. The law says a marriage can be dissolved when one party causes grievous harm to the other. Judge Hartford said sternly. And from what I'm hearing, that's exactly what's happened here. Sheriff Morrison, I suggest you keep Mr. Dawson away from Mrs. Dawson until this matter is resolved legally. You heard the judge, Morrison said, finally finding his backbone. Henry, I think it's time you went home. This isn't over, Henry repeated, but the threat sounded hollow now. He was just one man, stripped of the fear that had given him power. You'll all regret this, every last one of you. He stomped away, shoving through the crowd, leaving behind a silence that slowly filled with whispers, then normal conversation. The crisis had passed. For now. Luke felt Abigail sag against him and quickly guided her to a bench. You did it, he said softly. You stood up to him in front of everyone. We did it, she corrected, her voice shaky but triumphant. All of us together. Judge Hartford approached them. Mrs. Dawson, I'll need you to come by tomorrow to file the official papers. Given the circumstances and the multiple witnesses, I can grant a swift dissolution, but you should know, Henry won't take this lying down. I know, Abigail said. But I'm not alone anymore. As if to prove her point, the women of the town surrounded her, Eleanor, Martha, Charlotte, Sarah, and others, forming a protective wall of sisterhood that Henry Dawson could never break through. The social resumed, though with a different energy than before. There was something electric in the air, a sense that things had shifted fundamentally. The town had stood up to a bully and won, had chosen justice over the easy path of looking away. As the sun began to set, Luke and Abigail found a quiet moment alone near the church garden. What happens now? She asked. Now you get your freedom, Luke said, legal and proper. And then... He paused, suddenly uncertain. Then you decide what you want to do with it. She looked up at him, her eyes soft in the dying light. I thought that was obvious. I want to spend it with the man who gave it back to me, if he'll have me. Abigail. Luke's voice was rough with emotion. You know I love you, but you need time. Time to heal, to be your own person again. I won't be another man trying to own you. You could never be that, she said firmly. You're the man who taught me I was worth fighting for, who stood beside me instead of over me. I don't need time to know what my heart wants. Luke Callahan, it wants you. They kissed then, there in the church garden with half the town probably watching, and Luke felt something settle in his chest, a rightness, a completion he hadn't known he'd been missing. But even as he held her, he knew the fight wasn't over. Henry was out there, wounded and dangerous. The legal process would take time, and Henry wouldn't accept defeat easily. There would be more troubles ahead. But for now, in this moment, They had won something precious, not just Abigail's freedom, but the town's soul. Dusty Creek had chosen to be a place where the vulnerable were protected, where might didn't make right, where a woman's voice could be heard and believed. It was a start, and sometimes, Luke thought as he held Abigail close, a start was all you needed to change everything. The week following the church social was deceptively quiet. Abigail filed her divorce papers with Judge Hartford, who expedited the process given the overwhelming evidence and witness testimony. Henry had retreated to his ranch, and for a few days, it seemed like he might accept defeat gracefully. Luke should have known better. The first sign of trouble came when Tom Wheeler rode out to the ranch, his horse lathered with sweat from hard riding. "Henry's been in town," Tom said without preamble, "buying ammunition, supplies, and he's hired some men rough types from the mining camps up north. Word is he's planning something." Luke felt his blood run cold. "How many men?" "4, maybe 5. Jake Morrison saw them riding in last night." Tom glanced at Abigail, who'd come out at the sound of horses. "Folks are worried. Luke, some are saying you should take Mrs. Dawson and leave town until this blows over." "Running won't solve anything," Luke said firmly. "Henry will just follow, or wait until we think we're safe." "Then what?" Tom asked. Luke was quiet for a moment, thinking, in war, when you knew an attack was coming, you didn't wait passively, you prepared, you chose your ground, and you made sure the enemy paid dearly for every inch. "We make our stand," he said finally. "Here, where we know the land. Tom, can you get word to the men who stood with us at the social? Tell them I'm not asking them to fight my battle. But if Henry brings violence to this town, we need to be ready." Tom nodded grimly. "I'll spread the word. When do you think he'll move?" "Soon," Luke said. "His kind doesn't like to wait. Probably tomorrow, maybe the day after." After Tom left, Luke found Abigail standing by the window, her arms wrapped around herself. He went to her, pulling her close. "I'm scared," she admitted against his chest. "Not for me. I've faced Henry's anger before. But for you, for the people who've stood by us." "Fear's natural," Luke said softly. "But we're not alone in this. The town's behind us now." "Some of them," Abigail corrected. "Others still think I'm a troublemaker who should have kept quiet and endured." "Those people never had someone's fist in their face," Luke said grimly. "Don't worry about them. Worry about being ready for what's coming." They spent the day preparing. Luke cleaned and loaded every weapon he owned, checked sight lines from the windows, moved furniture to provide cover if needed. Abigail helped, her movement steady despite the fear he could see in her eyes. As evening fell, Eleanor Walsh arrived with Martha Henderson and, surprisingly, Charlotte Morrison. "We're staying," Eleanor announced, brooking no argument. "You need witnesses if Henry tries something. And besides," she patted the shotgun she carried, "I'm a fair shot when needed." "This isn't your fight," Luke protested. "Isn't it?" Charlotte asked sharply. "When a man thinks he can terrorize a woman without consequence, it's every woman's fight, and every decent man's too." By nightfall, they weren't alone. Tom Wheeler returned with George Sullivan and 3 other ranchers. Sheriff Morrison arrived, looking sheepish but determined. "I should have done more before," the sheriff admitted. "But I'm here now. This is still my town, and I won't let Henry turn it into a battlefield." They settled in for a long night, men positioned at strategic points around the ranch, women inside with Abigail. Luke walked the perimeter, checking on each defender, feeling the familiar pre-battle tension settling over him like an old coat. It was near dawn when they came. Luke saw the dust cloud first, riders approaching fast from the east. He gave a low whistle, the signal they'd agreed on, and everyone moved to their positions. Henry rode at the front of 6 men, all armed, all with the hard look of men who killed for money. They pulled up just outside rifle range, and Henry's voice carried clearly in the still morning air. "Callahan, send out my wife, and we'll ride away peaceful-like." "She's not your wife anymore. Henry," Luke called back. "Judge Hartford dissolved the marriage. It's over." "No piece of paper changes what's mine," Henry shouted. "Last chance. Callahan. Send her out, or we're coming in, and anyone who stands with you dies." Luke glanced at his defenders. Not a one wavered. Tom Wheeler actually grinned and spat tobacco juice into the dust. "You want her. You come get her," Luke shouted. "But you'll pay for every step." For a moment, nothing happened. Then Henry raised his hand, and his hired guns spread out, beginning their advance. The morning exploded into chaos. Gunfire erupted from both sides. Luke's defenders had good positions and better motivation. They were protecting one of their own. Henry's mercenaries were skilled but cautious, not eager to die for another man's pride. Luke focused on Henry, tracking him through the melee. This wouldn't end until one of them was down. He squeezed off a shot that took Henry's hat off, causing the man to curse and dive for cover behind a water trough. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. One of Henry's men went down, clutching his shoulder. Another fled entirely when George Sullivan's accurate fire made his position untenable. Then Luke saw his chance. Henry broke from cover, trying to reach the house's side door. Luke stepped out from behind the fence post, his rifle steady. "Henry," he called. Henry spun, his pistol rising. For a moment, they faced each other across 20 yards of dusty ground, the abusive husband and the man who dared to protect his victim. "This is for every bruise you gave her," Luke said quietly, and fired. His bullet caught Henry in the chest, spinning him around. Henry's shot went wild, and he fell to his knees, then forward into the dust. The gunfire stopped. Henry's remaining men, seeing their employer down, threw up their hands. Sheriff Morrison and his deputies moved in, disarming them. Luke walked slowly to where Henry lay. The man was still alive, but barely. Blood frothed on his lips as he looked up at Luke with fading eyes. "She was mine," Henry gasped. "No," Luke said firmly. "She was never yours. She was always her own." Henry tried to speak again, but only blood came out. His eyes fixed on something distant, and then he was gone. Luke stood there for a moment, feeling nothing, no triumph, no regret, just a weary sense of ending. He turned to find Abigail standing in the doorway, Eleanor's protective arm around her. Their eyes met across the battlefield, and in hers he saw not the frightened woman who'd stepped off the train weeks ago, but someone strong, someone who'd found her courage. She walked to him, stepping carefully around the violence that had been wrought in her name. "It's over," she said softly. "Yes," Luke agreed, pulling her close. "It's over." Sheriff Morrison approached, his face grave. "There'll be an inquest, but with all these witnesses, it's clear self-defense." Henry brought this on himself. The sun was fully up now, revealing the damaged bullet holes in Luke's buildings, the acrid smell of gunpowder, blood soaking into the dusty ground, but also revealing the faces of neighbors who'd risked their lives for justice, who'd stood up to be counted when it mattered most. "What happens now?" Martha Henderson asked, voicing what everyone was thinking. "Now we rebuild," Luke said. "The barn Henry burned, the fences his men cut. We move forward." "Together," Abigail added, her hand finding his, as the defenders dispersed, helping to clean up and tend to the wounded. Judge Hartford arrived. He surveyed the scene grimly. "I heard what happened. Henry Dawson made his choice, and he paid the price for it." He looked at Abigail. "Your divorce papers were finalized yesterday. You're a free woman, Mrs. Turner." Abigail nodded, tears streaming down her face, tears of relief, of grief for what might have been, of joy for what could be now. That evening, as the sun set over the ranch, Luke and Abigail sat on the porch, The day's violence seemed like a distant nightmare, something that had happened to other people in another life. "I never wanted this," Abigail said quietly. "The violence, the death. If I'd known." "If you'd known, you'd still have had the courage to stand up for yourself," Luke said firmly. "Henry's death is on him, not you. He chose violence at every turn." "And you chose to protect me," she said, looking up at him. "Even though it cost you so much." "It gave me more than it cost," Luke said. "It gave me you." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars appear one by one. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, rebuilding, healing, learning to live without the shadow of fear, but they would face it together. "Luke," Abigail said softly. When Judge Hartford said I was free, he called me Mrs. Turner, my maiden name." She paused, gathering courage. "But I was thinking, maybe someday, when enough time has passed, when it's proper, I might like to try a different name." Luke's heart skipped. What name would that be? She smiled, that transformative expression he'd first glimpsed over fresh bread. "Callahan. Abigail Callahan. If the offer's open." "The offer," Luke said, pulling her closer, "will be open as long as you want it." As they sat together in the gathering darkness, Luke thought about the strange paths that led people to each other. Violence and pain had brought Abigail to his door, but love and courage had made her stay. They'd won their battle, paid their price, and earned their chance at happiness. And in the wild frontier of Wyoming territory, where law was what you made it and justice came at the barrel of a gun, that was no small victory. It was, in fact, everything. 6 months had passed since that violent dawn, and the Wyoming autumn painted the landscape in shades of gold and rust. Luke stood at the newly rebuilt barn, admiring the solid construction. The whole town had turned out for the barn raising, a symbol of how much had changed since Henry Dawson's death. "It's straighter than the old one," Abigail said, coming to stand beside him. She carried a basket of apples from the trees they'd planted together in the spring. Her transformation still took his breath away. Gone was the frightened woman who'd stepped off the train. In her place stood someone confident, strong, and radiantly happy. "Everything's better now," Luke said, taking the basket from her and stealing a quick kiss. They'd been married for 2 months, in a ceremony that saw the church packed to overflowing. Even Sheriff Morrison had smiled through his wife's tears of joy. "Letter from Boston," Abigail said, pulling an envelope from her apron pocket. "From Cousin Margaret." Luke tensed slightly. Letters from Abigail's past life always carried the potential for complications. "Good news. The best." Abigail's eyes shone. "Father's debts have been settled. It seems a distant uncle passed and left a small inheritance. Margaret wants to know if I might visit." "Do you want to?" Abigail considered, then shook her head. "Boston feels like someone else's life now. This is my home. You're my home." They walked together toward the house, passing the new garden where vegetables grew in neat rows. Eleanor Walsh had taught Abigail well, and their root cellar was full of preserves for the winter ahead. "The Women's Committee is meeting tomorrow," Abigail mentioned. "Charlotte Morrison says we have 3 new members, women who finally found the courage to speak up about their situations." The committee had become a force in Dusty Creek, providing support and safe haven for women in difficult marriages. What had started as a response to Abigail's situation had grown into something larger, something that was changing the very fabric of the town. "Good," Luke said. "Every woman deserves to feel safe in her own home." As they reached the porch, riders appeared on the horizon. Luke's hand moved instinctively toward his rifle, old habits dying hard. But then he recognized Tom Wheeler's distinctive hat. "Luke, Mrs. Callahan," Tom called as he rode up, grinning broadly. "Got news from town." "What kind of news?" Luke asked, helping Abigail up the porch steps. "The best kind. Town council voted to fund a women's shelter. Charlotte Morrison pushed it through, said it was time Dusty Creek became known for protecting folks instead of turning a blind eye. Abigail gasped, her hand flying to her chest. Truly, they approved it. Unanimously. Tom confirmed. They want to name it Turner House, after you. Said you showed the courage that changed everything. Tears welled in Abigail's eyes. Luke pulled her close, feeling her tremble with emotion. I never imagined, she whispered. When I stepped off that train, I thought I was walking into a prison. Instead, I found freedom, love, and now this. You found your voice, Luke corrected gently, and you used it to help others find theirs. As Tom rode off with promises to return for Sunday dinner, Luke and Abigail settled on their porch to watch the sunset, the same porch where they'd sat in those early, uncertain days, when fear and hope had warred in both their hearts. Do you ever think about him? Abigail asked quietly. Henry, sometimes. Luke admitted, not with anger anymore, just sadness, for the man he could have been if he'd chosen differently. I pray for his soul, Abigail said. Is that strange to pray for the man who hurt me? No, Luke said. It shows the kind of person you are, the kind who can find forgiveness even for the unforgivable. They sat quietly for a while, watching the sky turn from blue to orange to purple. A cool breeze brought the scent of coming rain and the sound of cattle lowing in the distance. I have something to tell you, Abigail said suddenly, a new note in her voice. Luke turned to her, concerned. What is it? She took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. Eleanor confirmed it yesterday. Come spring, there'll be 3 of us on this ranch. Luke stared at her, joy and wonder flooding through him. We're having a baby. We're having a baby, she confirmed, laughing at his expression. Are you happy? Happy. Luke pulled her into his arms, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around. I'm the happiest man in Wyoming territory, in all the territories. As he set her down, both of them laughing and crying at once. Luke marveled at the journey that had brought them here, a desperate woman fleeing an abusive marriage, a lonely rancher who couldn't turn away from injustice, violence and fear transformed into love and hope. What do you want, boy or girl? Abigail asked as they settled back on the porch. Healthy, Luke said immediately, and strong like their mother, kind like their father, Abigail added, with the courage to stand up for what's right. They'll have quite a story, Luke mused, how their parents met. A story of redemption. Abigail said, of how love can bloom even in the harshest ground, of how one person standing up for what's right can change everything. As darkness fell, they moved inside their home, not just a house anymore, but a true home filled with love and laughter and the promise of new life. The oil lamps cast a warm glow over the simple furnishings, over Abigail's books mixed with Luke's on the shelf, over the quilt Eleanor and the other women had made as a wedding gift. I love you, Abigail said suddenly, apropos of nothing and everything. And I love you, Luke replied, forever. Forever, she agreed. Just like I chose that day at the church social, when I stood up in front of everyone and said enough, when you stood beside me and said the same. They prepared for bed, moving through the familiar routines of a married couple. But as Luke banked the fire and Abigail brushed out her long hair, he thought about all the small moments that had led to this. The first time she'd smiled at him over fresh bread. The night she'd asked him to sleep in the parlor so she wouldn't be alone. The day she'd found the courage to face down her abuser in front of the whole town. Luke, Abigail called from their bedroom. Are you coming? Just checking the locks, he called back, though the truth was he no longer feared midnight visitors. The locks were habit now, not necessity. As he joined his wife in their bed, Luke thought about the letter he'd write tomorrow to his sister back east, telling her about the baby. She'd been after him for years to settle down, to find someone to share his life with. He smiled. imagining her reaction. "What are you thinking about?" Abigail asked, nestling against his shoulder. "The future," Luke said. "Our child running through these rooms, teaching them to ride, to read, to be brave and kind and true, to know they're loved." Abigail added softly, "To never doubt their worth or their right to happiness." "Yes," Luke agreed. "All of that." As sleep began to claim them, Luke's last coherent thought was one of profound gratitude. He'd spent years alone on this ranch, content but not truly happy. Now his life was full of love, of purpose, of the family he'd never dared dream of having. Abigail had often said he'd saved her that night he'd stood between her and Henry's fists. But the truth was, she'd saved him too. Saved him from a life half-lived, from the loneliness he'd wrapped around himself like armor after the war. They'd saved each other, and in doing so, they'd helped save their town, transforming it from a place where violence was ignored to one where justice and compassion could flourish. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows slightly, but inside, all was warm and safe and right. A cowboy and his mail-order bride, who'd found in each other not what they'd expected, but exactly what they'd needed. And as the stars wheeled overhead and the coyotes called in the distance, Luke Callahan held his wife close and knew that some choices, once made, really were forever. The best choices always were. In the morning, there would be chores to do, committee meetings to attend, a future to build. But for now, in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, there was only peace and love, and the promise of all the tomorrows to come. The end had become a beginning, and in the Wild West, where happy endings were as rare as rain in August, that was nothing short of a miracle. Thank you all for listening to this story of love, courage, and redemption in the Old West. I hope Luke and Abigail's journey touched your heart as much as it touched mine in the telling. I'd love to hear where you're listening from. Please share in the comments below so we can connect and discuss what this story meant to you. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to Wild West Night for more stories of the American frontier. Hit that like button and press the hype button to help more people discover this video. Until next time, may you always have the courage to stand up for what's right, and may love find you when you least expect it.